Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right to podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Aspire podcast. I'm Chessy Prout, co-founder of I Have the Right To. Aspire, the podcast, was created by I Have the Right To as a space for honest, meaningful conversations about survivor advocacy, prevention, and what it truly takes to create safer communities. If these conversations resonate with you and you're interested in bringing them into your school or community, we'd love to connect. I Have the Right To partners with K-12 schools, colleges, and universities to provide age-appropriate programming for students, educators, and parents on consent, healthy relationships, digital safety, leadership, and more, helping turn these conversations into action. You can reach us at takeaction@ihavetheright2.org. Before we jump into our conversation with today's guest, I wanted to take a moment to introduce our co-hosts, Maria and Steve Peacock. Maria is I Have the Right To's amazing communications director. She leads the organization's social media presence and marketing strategies. Maria holds a law degree and a master's in intellectual property law. But alongside her legal and advocacy work, Maria discovered a love for graphic design and marketing. She is now dedicated to amplifying the organization's message, and we would not be where we are today without her. Steve Peacock is a board member and friend of I Have the Right To. He is a survivor, advocate, and a national speaker who shares his powerful journey from silence to strength and how using his voice helped him heal. Steve and Maria, thank you so much for being here for this conversation today.
Thank you, Chessy. Just want to start by thanking you and Hilary for being such passionate advocates for survivors in both inspirational and actionable ways. You are changing practices and you are changing laws. So excited for the conversation today.
Now, we'd love to start the conversation today with you, Hilary, because, as survivors, a lot of the times our identities can become tied up into the worst thing that somebody's done to us. So I'd love to start by asking you who you were as a child, as a young adult, the parts of yourself that you love and want to share with our audience, and maybe a little bit about who you are today.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chessy. And I just want to say it's such an honor to be here. We talked a little bit beforehand about how there's 3 survivors on this podcast today and how rare that is. And it just feels like such an honor. And before I go into my own story, just want to talk a little bit about my connection to I Have the Right To. Early on in my survivor journey, I Have the Right To reached out to me, and it felt like a warm hug. My story had been silent for over 2 decades, so I hadn't reported what happened to me. And when I came forward as a public survivor and it was in the press, I Have the Right To reached out, and they said all the things that I had been wanting to hear for so long. Like, we believe you, we see what happened, we want to fix this for the next generation. And it was just so important to me and to my healing process. And through my conversations with you, Chessy, and you, Steve, and Susan, and Karen, and Alex, and Katie, I felt connected to something so much bigger than my own story. So I'm really grateful, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation. Um, and as for who I was before this all happened, I need to take you back to a 14-year-old girl. I showed up at the gates of Miss Hall School in 2001, and that girl, that 14-year-old, she's still inside of me, and she's been with me through every courtroom and every late night and every moment that I've performed my way through life trying to outrun what happened to her. And she's not hiding anymore. She's my beacon. She's the reason that I'm here today. And before I went to Miss Hall's, where I was groomed and sexually abused by a teacher, um, I was I lived in Connecticut, and my family was dealing with a lot in my formative years. A close family member was dealing with serious mental health issues, and it shaped a lot of my personality. I learned now that I learned to manage others' expectations and emotions before my own. I learned to not take up space and to be small, which is important for then how I dealt with the abuse later on. And so I showed up at this all girls boarding school in Pittsfield, Massachusetts at 14, and I was a kid with a lot of hope. I had hope that this would be different than home and that it would be a safe place. I was a kid like all kids who needed nurturing and protection, and I had hoped that the adults around me would provide that. Um, Instead, I was groomed and abused by a teacher who was also a cross country coach of mine, as well as an advisor and a dorm parent. He was really woven into every fabric of daily life at boarding school, as many teachers are. It can be like a family environment, which is a double-edged sword, because when there's safe teachers and safe faculty members and staff, that's excellent. But predators can really take advantage of that environment, which is what happened here. And he really used all of that access to target me and isolate me. And it was a really slow process. And I think that's something really important. The grooming was really gradual. And it was really just years of boundary erosions until there was no boundaries left. And in my story, the school knew what happened and it was reported and nothing was done, which led me to believe, okay, this is something that I should also think is okay. When you see adults around you indicating that this behavior is okay, that's what you think as a child as well. When I graduated from Miss Hall's, he maintained psychological control over me for years. He said that he would kill himself if I spoke up. So I didn't. I ran, not away from anything, but into college and law school and degrees and milestones and accomplishments. I built a life that looks a lot like success. And in many ways it was. And it was also survival. I got married. I had a child who is now 5, which I'm so grateful for. But inside, I dealt with a lot of anxiety, postpartum depression, building up walls between myself and others that I loved, and getting back into harmful relational dynamics and just struggling while also succeeding outwardly. And 2 years ago, a phone call that I received changed the trajectory of my life. Another survivor of the same teacher, Matthew Rutledge, had courageously come forward to the school and had hired an attorney. And her attorney reached out to me. Her name is Melissa Ferris. And I spoke to Melissa that day. And that call was eye opening and life changing. We discovered that he'd used the same exact playbook on both of us, the same grooming techniques, the same isolation, even the same pet name. And that conversation was the first time in over 20 years that I allowed myself to think maybe this wasn't my choice or my fault. And I had a choice. I could keep running or I could stop and finally deal with it. And so I came forward publicly. I filed a lawsuit. And through that fight, showing up not just for myself, but for all the girls that the school had failed, I found something that I didn't know I had, which is my true voice. And I've since settled my lawsuit and I've committed to the deep work of healing, which has been very difficult, and also pouring it all into advocacy and prevention. Um, and that's the story in a nutshell. I'm an attorney in New York. I'm a litigation partner at a global law firm, and I have a 5-year-old son.
Thank you so much for sharing a bit about your background and where you are today. I know that sharing your story can be so many different things at the same time. It can be liberating, it can be painful, it can be re-traumatizing, it can also be freeing. It helps a lot of people to hear what you've gone through and to be seen, feel seen in what you've gone through. Obviously, you've provided so much guidance to Melissa and to probably many other people who have read and heard of your story. And I do just want to acknowledge, though, that sharing your story can be meaningful and it can be extremely difficult to do. So thank you for coming forward and for sharing your story publicly and for doing so before you also knew that what had been done to you by this teacher was a pattern. I think a lot of the times it becomes easier to stand when you're not standing alone. But at the same time, it is so important that survivors who might feel alone or isolated also know that their experiences matter as well. I'd love to hear from you what your experience was coming forward and feeling alone versus when you were able to connect with another survivor, either just another survivor or connecting with Melissa, another survivor from the same perpetrator.
Sure. So I mean, the first time that I disclosed the abuse was to a therapist, and I really thought it was a secret that I would die with, and because the school had made it seem like it was something that was okay, and I didn't know that there was anyone else that had gone through this. I did feel alone for so many years, and I felt like there was nothing that I could do. I couldn't come forward. He was beloved by the school. He had been there for 33 years, and he was getting faculty honors, he was getting promotions, and I saw all that. And when you know that the school was aware of some of his behavior towards me and is still protecting him in the way that they did, I didn't feel that there was anything that I could do. I knew that I was internally struggling and realizing, okay, this was abuse and I'm not okay, but I don't know how to move forward from it. I don't know how to make this go away, to get any closure from it. So that was why connecting with Melissa was so life-changing for me to hear. I carried so much shame for so many years, so much shame that's not mine, and so many survivors do, particularly survivors of this type of abuse where it's by someone who you thought loved you. And that's what the grooming is designed to look like. It's designed to look like love, mentorship, and you don't realize it at the time. Um, and then it turns dark, and then you're just confused, and you don't know. There's no outlet. The person has isolated you to the point where there's no outlets to report, and they're designed to keep you quiet. So when I spoke to Melissa, I realized, okay, this isn't just me. This was a predator running a system. And I'm sure it's not just you, Melissa. I'm sure that there's other women that this happened to. This teacher was there for 33 years. So I knew at that time that we had to find the other survivors. We had to figure out not only what happened to us, but what happened to them. And more importantly, how he was allowed to keep teaching there for 33 years when the school knew about what happened and it was reported, and they chose to call it silly teenagers gossiping about a handsome teacher. They chose to make people not graduate from the school because they tried to report his behavior. And I found out recently that the former assistant head of school told a staff member who reported his behavior with me that I was a liar without ever talking to me, without ever asking me or my parents a single question. She and the institution chose to protect a predator over a child. And that decision had disastrous consequences because as Melissa and I came forward, I really poured all my efforts into investigation and figuring out what happened here. And I was able to find a number of other survivors that also came forward and heard from them eerily similar stories to what I experienced. And we were able to start a movement at the school where they made some really important changes, and the school will never be the same. And I think the students that go there are a lot safer now because of the actions that we took.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. So much, Hillary, of what you said resonated with me. And in our conversations after you had listened to me on the podcast, as well around feeling alone. Like it was something I did. It was a mistake I made. Like I really took more ownership in that, not realizing that it was part of a grooming process. And I didn't know how to think about it. Like you said, in the context of my life was just happening, just as you said, there were adults around you, even after finding out about it, really treating this as if it was, some type of other issue rather than what it actually was and sexual assault. Um, and so much of then what happened to me anyway was uh, real consequences on how I thought about power and trust being foundational to relationships. It is so difficult to kind of navigate through life after something like this destroys that trust. So when I think about your story, and for people who are just hearing it for the first time, what context feels important to name about the environment at Miss Hall's school, especially around power and trust?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, this teacher, Matthew Rutledge, he was treated like a god at the school. He was treated as a esteemed faculty member, and it's never the people that are those family man. The people don't look at those people and think, oh, that person's a sexual predator, and so they often dismiss very clear cues that this person isn't behaving appropriately because of the power that they have within that institution and within that structure of that environment. And in my case, because he was so powerful at the school, he really could do whatever he wanted. And when I was there, the abuse didn't happen in the shadows. It's a very small school. There's less than 200 students at the school, and faculty and staff are very plugged into what's happening on campus. And they saw me with him alone on campus a lot. They saw him taking me off campus often to go on running excursions, trails, and that's something that shouldn't be happening. And because of his position at the school, no one took a second look. In fact, there was a faculty member that saw him with me once taking me off campus, and she said, be a good girl for Mr. Rutledge." Um, it was very normalized. And I think that was what led me to believe that I should think this is okay, even though I was confused and I didn't believe that it was. I had this man who was isolating me, but yet making me feel special and making me feel like I was his best friend. But then systematically breaking down boundaries that no adult should ever do with a child. And when students would try to report his behavior, or even staff members, they never went beyond questioning him. They never called me. They never called my parents. They didn't do anything. They just let him continue teaching there for another 19 years and promoted him. And for me, I think what happened, and I don't think a lot of people understand this, but the exploitation, it doesn't stop like when you leave the building. That trauma bond, that confusion, that lack of connection to other people that you talked about, Steve, it follows you through life. And for me, it lived in my body, and I couldn't really name it for years, but eventually I'm so glad that I was able to. And because I know that the average age of survivors coming forward is 53 years old, and I'm in my 30s, and to be able to have this realization of what happened and the support and able to be on this healing journey means so much.
There are so many different kinds of betrayal that are recognizable in your story, and in the stories of so many survivors. And we have an interesting conversation coming up with a producer and advocate named Ashley Lauren Elrod. And we talked about how children are taught to listen, conform, listen to your parents, listen to your teachers, listen to the adults. But then all of a sudden, children become adults, and it can become really difficult as you grow up to be able to zoom in to yourself and say, okay, well, what do I feel about this? How do I feel about, being asked to go somewhere alone by somebody else? I've been told my whole life that they're adults, they're safe adults, they're teachers. Listen to them, do what they say. There's so much that we're kind of told to do that we lose track of who we are as individuals. And, as children, there is so much guidance and support that we need from trusted adults and parents. But I think it's so important to be able to recognize when something is wrong, to trust your own gut instead of having to go by the gut of your parents or teachers or administrators at a school, because schools and institutions so rarely have the well-being of their students and the people under their care in mind. I wouldn't love to, but I feel like this is a unique opportunity for us to talk about institutional betrayal and how devastating that is. You talk about how you've been harmed by not just a person, but there's an entire system that has failed to protect you and the students at Miss Hall's, the students at St. Paul's, and the students at so many schools around the world. Now, would you be able to get into as far or as little as you want into the institutional betrayal that you experienced and how you've used your career and your background to fight against that sort of institutional betrayal for students moving forward?
Definitely. And I think I first want to touch on something because as you were talking in the beginning about the adaptations that our body takes in order to deal with adults who we are supposed to trust, and how as children we deal with that, and then as adults it follows us. So in the beginning of the conversation, I talked about a little bit about my childhood and how that shaped me personality wise, of putting others' needs before myself and making myself small. And I've learned recently that there's another survival response other than flight, fight, or freeze, and it's called fawning. And we don't really talk enough about it. It's a little new. There's books on it now, but I think for me, it's been really foundational and important in my healing journey to realize not just what fawning is, but to realize how it shaped me and how I can, as you said, go back to your own self and what I need and trust my own compass rather than relying on others. And so fawning is it's when your survival strategy is to appease, to please, to make yourself agreeable and unthreatening so that the person who has power over you won't hurt you. And so instead of running or fighting, you become what that dangerous person needs you to be. You learn safety through compliance. And that has been my response to sexual abuse in real time. It was my response at Miss Hall's and subsequent experiences that I had as an adult. I didn't fight. I didn't run. I fawned. I became a cooperative, perfect victim because my nervous system learned that was the way to survive. And those trauma responses don't just turn off when the danger ends. They become your operating system and they follow you wherever you go. And that was my experience. So I wanted to say that as to fawning, but institutional betrayal is a really important part of my story, and I know yours as well, Chessy. And it's really a double wound because you're not just harmed by the person, but by this entire system that was supposed to protect you, that your parents sent you as a child to provide this safe environment, and it ended up doing the opposite. In my case, after we found a number of other survivors of the same teacher, we petitioned the school to do an independent investigation. And so they hired a law firm called Alita Law, and they spoke with hundreds of students and faculty and staff and parents and issued a 60-page report, which lays out in detail the institutional betrayal that we knew happened as survivors, but it really put it into print. And it showed that the school, Miss Hall's, had received many instances of information that was credible regarding unmistakably inappropriate conduct by Matthew Rutledge with students as early as 10 years before I arrived at the school, so the early 90s to the mid-2000s, and they did nothing about it other than let him keep teaching there. And they also, as I mentioned, they expelled girls for reporting his behavior. And the report also uncovered 8 substantiated counts of other faculty and staff dating from the 1940s. So I think that that's the other part about institutional betrayal, which is really important, is that it's often not just one person, it's an entire culture, and it becomes an entire system. And the way that schools respond to these allegations change the culture of the institution moving forward. And I think that that's, in my case, the hopeful part of the story is that the current head of school, Julia Heaton, she acknowledged in the report that she didn't do enough to protect the well-being of students, and she wasn't there when I was at the school. And, I really appreciated that acknowledgement. But real accountability means more than words. And in the case of Miss Hall's, they have taken a lot of steps to make the school safer and to remove some of the things that were in place that allowed Matt Rutledge to abuse students, like not having teachers meet alone with students in classrooms or take them off campus or drive them, things which would seem very I think maybe just to survivors would seem very like, yes, that definitely should not be happening. But in the case of Miss Halls, it still was happening until he left the school in 2024. And I think that's the other important thing to remember is that, these predators, they don't stop until often survivors come forward. So it's on the survivors, which it shouldn't be, to change the culture of these schools and these institutions. And that's the only way that they change. When Melissa and I came forward, we were contacted by several students who were still at the school who indicated that he was spending alone time with them. He was treating them like they were special, like grooming, things that are very clear grooming behaviors. And, I realized that he he never stopped, and he wasn't going to until the survivors came forward. Um, so that's the unfortunate thing. But in this case, Miss Halls did make a number of steps, and also the fact that they released that report publicly was relatively rare. And it's, in addition, just how they dealt with the entire thing. Instead of attacking the accuser, the survivors, they they called us survivors instead of victims or accusers, and they didn't deny it. They didn't deny what happened. They were careful and supportive in their language, and none of that erases the harm, but it matters for the model that it sets. And I think other institutions need to see institutions like Miss Hall's choosing transparency. And it's painful, but it's the only path forward in these matters.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Hillary. And I absolutely, Chessy, want to get your take on institutional betrayal because of the similarities. Um, but just to take a brief pause on a couple of things you were saying for everybody out there listening who is a survivor who doesn't know if they are a survivor, just know that something was done. And to your point about 52 years old, 53 years old, the average age of childhood sexual disclosure, while I did disclose to some family members in my 20s, it really wasn't until my 50s that I was able to actually disclose publicly and have these conversations. So that internal force and power of destruction is so ingrained, based on that kind of loss of trust, as I alluded to earlier. But the other thing I want to just kind of point out is that you're only a child once. Like, that's it. You get one opportunity, and you know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. So when something happens to you, and actually I'll correct myself as I often do, nothing happens to people in this area. Things are done to people. And when you were intentionally targeted and when you were groomed, as you said so vividly, the the normal kind of boundaries that we have as children was eroded so slowly that even for adults, when that happens, it's very hard to recognize. So when you're a child, as going through life, and whether you do have you know education or not in this area, which is why it's a combination of education and parents and teachers and adults, kind of keep paying attention to this stuff and protecting our community. But when you're a child, it is so confusing. And you also alluded to the fact that nobody's childhood is perfect. And during those times, we feel sad, we feel lonely, which can often make us more attractive targets for groomers who can see that. So they take advantage of. They learn where the weakness is, and So sadly, this is not just a commentary on sexual abuse, but more broadly in our world, they see weakness and they take advantage of it. Where what we really need people to do is to see people who are suffering and offer help. So I admire the fact that you are bringing this forward, and for people like me in my age bracket, I point to Hilary, I point to Chessy. I know it's hard to live with it, um, but I submit it's gets a lot easier when you have a community that can support you, that can help you, that can guide you and give you the love and care that you need to heal. And just one final thing, Hilary, I'd love your thoughts on this, because I have yet publicly to say the name of the person who abused me, and I think it's a final thing that I'm kind of working towards. But how does it feel, for you to be able to say his name and to name the person who did this tremendous harm to you?
It feels really powerful. It feels devastating, of course, but also powerful, and it took a lot of time for me to be able to get to the place where I was able to do that. Um, as I mentioned earlier, the shame and the fear and just this cycle that you get stuck in of shame and fear and just confusion about what actually happened. And for me, it really took connecting with the other survivors to be able to name what happened to me and also name the perpetrator that who did this to us. And it felt really important, um, for a lot of reasons. And I can talk about my advocacy work in Massachusetts. But this predator, Matthew Rutledge, has not been criminally charged for what he did for 33 years, running a system in Miss Halls and abusing students for 33 years.
Unbelievable.
And yes. And so for me and for the other survivors, it became really important to hold him accountable in whatever way that we could. And for Melissa and I, that was filing a civil lawsuit. For me, I filed against the school and she filed against him directly. And that her lawsuit remains pending. And it was really important for me to speak out in the press and to say what happened. So there was a public record that couldn't ever be taken away. And initially, I was very against the press. I'm a really private person. It wasn't ever a route that I thought that I would go down. But when Melissa first came forward and the story came out in the local paper, the Berkshire Eagle, one of the other survivors who had absolutely no connection to Miss Halls after she graduated more than 30 years prior, had reached out to Melissa and I's attorney and said, "You have to believe Melissa. She's telling the truth. This happened to me." And she had held this story inside for 30 years and was never going to come forward. And I realized at that moment the power of the press in not only the Miss Hall story, but helping other survivors not to feel alone. And I think that that is why, one of the reasons why I continue to name him, to make it clear that it can be safe for other survivors to do the same thing. And it's powerful. And the shame isn't on you. It's on the person who caused this harm. And you should not feel that. And you should put it back where it belongs, which is with the predator.
I think that what you say is so important, especially that element of shame. And one of the things that is so incredible about you coming forward is that you shine a light to that dynamic of grooming that is so often misunderstood. I think that there is this dramatization of how grooming happens, and you were mentioning how gradual of a process is. And so our organization wants to educate everyone, teachers, parents, students about the realities of groomings and why so hard to see until it happens. What do you think are some things that you wish parents, students, educators understood about how it works psychologically? What were the early dynamics that were easy to miss, that now with time you're like, I should have recognized this as harmful, and I wish I had someone to like have stopped it for me?
Definitely. So I think one of the reasons that survivors don't recognize grooming when it's happening is because it's designed to be unrecognizable. It's engineered to feel like love, and the whole strategy is the child not having the language for what happened to them. Nobody handed me a checklist at 14 and said, these are the things that a predator does. If I had that, and maybe I would have recognized it. And that's why education for these dynamics isn't optional. It's prevention. And I know that you had Dr. Elizabeth um, Jeglich, yes, who was on the podcast recently, and she identified 42 grooming behaviors in 5 stages. And that was really, really eye-opening for me to listen to, because every single stage played out exactly in my case, like almost to the letter. I know, Steve, you were talking about targeting vulnerable children. That's the first stage. And then gaining access and trust. That's the grooming. Desensitizing them to physical contact, which happened with me. It's like you put your hand he puts his hand on his back, and then that feels fine. And then on the knee, and then move up. And by the time a predator goes somewhere where no adult should ever take a child, you're trapped in that circumstance. And for a lot of survivors, there's nothing, you can't do anything by that point because you've been groomed for years, and they maintain control after the abuse to prevent disclosure. And that all happened in my case. So I think if I had known the word grooming at 14, it would have been different for me. When I was growing up, I learned about stranger danger. I learned about the man in the van, and that's often not the reality. Over 90% of child sexual abuse is someone that the child knows and trusts. And so the real threat is often the teacher, the coach, the mentor, the family friend, and that person, or someone that looks like love to you. And no one taught us how to recognize that when danger doesn't necessarily look like danger, when it looks like someone who cares about you. So I think we need to change that, beginning with very young children. We need to give young people the vocabulary of boundary violations and power dynamics and grooming. And these schools need reporting pathways that are accessible and safe and aren't going to result in them getting kicked out of school. And in my case, the faculty didn't understand what grooming looked like. And 20 years later, when they're talking to the investigators, they admit it. Oh, this was, we thought this wasn't like a behavior that should be happening, but we didn't really know what to do about it. We didn't know how to report it. And faculty need to understand that grooming continuum so that they can intervene at the first signal, the extra attention, the favoritism, the private time alone, and it doesn't escalate to the point where a survivor is having this lifelong trauma. So, it also extends to parents. You have to teach boundary setting at home. If your child describes a teacher that's treating them as special in ways that involve like private time or emotional exclusivity, you should listen to your child and ask questions and trust your instincts. And I think right now that's some of the most important work that I'm doing is at home with my own child, because it really starts, at bedtime, reading them stories. Katie Ship recommended The Big Little Chats with Jaylene Sanders, who's been on the podcast, which I read to my son. And that has been incredible. I think about who I want my son to be as a result of what happened to me. And, this prevention really starts not just in courtrooms or legislatures. It starts in a bedroom with your child on your lap, reading a bedtime story, and your child trusting that you're going to tell them the truth.
That's so true. And it's so important to remember that, because conversations about consent and healthy relationships and boundaries don't have to be painful. They don't have to come from a place of trauma. They can come from a place of power and empowerment, and teaching your child, your friends, your students how to use their voice. And your voice is so strong and so clear. I know how hard it is to come forward publicly, and not just publicly, but before that, to speak your trauma out loud and then to go through civil or legal processes. Can you share with us, you've spoken about the civil justice system and how brutal it can be for survivors, and I've experienced that myself. In so many ways, our institutions are not built, even the legal system is not built to help people find healing. That's absolutely not what it's about. But could you share with us how you made it through those systems to then come to the mindset of this can be used for good?
Sure. So as I mentioned, both Melissa and I filed civil lawsuits against the school. And one of the things that made that possible, that I carry with me every day as a privilege that I know a lot of survivors don't have, is that we had extraordinary support systems. We had a lot of people who believed in us, who showed up for us, and who held us when we couldn't hold ourselves. And without that, I don't think that I would have made it through. We also had incredible attorneys. Eric McLeish, who's known for the movie Spotlight. He represented survivors in the Catholic Church sex abuse cases. Um, he took our case, and his partner, Kristen Natilla, became a lifeline for me. When you're in these cases, I don't think a lot of people realize it's really isolating. There's things that you can only discuss with your attorney, things you can't discuss with your family, your friends, or in some cases, even a therapist. And so in my case, Kristen was the person that I could go to with all of that, and that relationship was really essential to surviving the litigation. And Chessy, as you mentioned, it is re-traumatizing. Discovery, depositions, cross-examination, having to tell the details of your story over and over again. It wasn't built with survivors' well-being in mind. And that's one of the reasons that I settled, because I wanted to move into advocacy work. I wanted to heal, and I felt that I was in survival mode as I was going through that process and not actually healing. And resolving a legal case, that's not the same as closure or healing. It's a legal mechanism, not an emotional one. It doesn't give you your childhood back. It doesn't undo the silence. It just, for me, it really closed one chapter so that I could begin another, which was my work in the advocacy space and also personal healing in therapy.
Thank you for sharing that, Hilary. And I want to go back to something you said that's related, which is stranger danger, and the man in the van. Great, catchy slogans, but almost remind me of when I was growing up, which is, we would have drills during school where we'd put our heads under our desks in the event of a Cold War nuclear attack. Would that have done anything? Probably not. But the idea was that this is the danger that you should be thinking about. And while I'm not saying that stranger danger does not happen, it does. But it is, and as you pointed out, in something like 10% of the cases. So the idea that it's somebody who's known to you, who's trusted by you, who's in a position of authority on you, who's known by your family. And I'm kind of ticking off all of the things that were the case for me, were the case for Chessy, and were the case for you. It is an important point for people to realize in life as a parent, as an educator, that you are going to want to trust people because that's how civilized society operates. But you need to realize that it cannot be a blind trust. It cannot be. You need to educate yourself. Like you pointed out, Hilary, those incredible markers of grooming and the staging and talking to your child is so important. And I also want to point out just that this is not a case where any gender is safe. So we as children, we're all vulnerable. We're all vulnerable, and it's so important to be talking to all of your kids, to everyone, so that they recognize that this is something that is occurring, is done to little boys, little girls, non-binary, members of the LGBT plus community, and we all need to look. We all need to look out for it. And then, when I think about the healing process from trauma, it's nonlinear, it's lifelong, it's different for everybody, particularly um, when I think about that um, elapsed time between the actual abuse and the comfort and support from loving adults and communities. It takes many shapes. It takes many shapes and forms, and I'm sure that's the case with you. And I'd love to, if you could just share with everybody a little bit about the less visible parts, the everyday parts of healing, and what they look like for you.
To that, before you answer, one of the things that you had mentioned was the internal family systems, and I am really, really interested in learning about what that means.
Sure. Yes. So for me, well, I mentioned when I was going through the legal case itself, it was really hard for me to actually do the healing work. And so when I settled my case, I felt this sense of peace and safety in my body that I hadn't before. So that hypervigilance, the feeling of being under siege constantly, it didn't disappear overnight, but it definitely loosened. And I felt like my nervous system finally got the signal that the fight is over and it's time now for you to really begin the healing work, put down the armor, and actually go back to the pain and relive it in a safe way so that you can finally move forward. And so for me, that's been pretty intensive therapy. I go to therapy twice a week, and it's like you said, Steve, it's the unseen parts of healing, which are not glamorous and they're hard. It's sitting in a room deliberately going back to the places that you spent 2 decades running from. It's reliving and reprocessing trauma that in my case, I'd buried so deep I didn't even have the language for it. And it's rewiring your nervous system to understand that you can be safe. And as Chessy talked about earlier, you can come home to yourself and to trust yourself and finally stop, in my case, fawning and stop relying on the opinions of everyone else and running and achievement and just really trust yourself. And so one of the modalities of therapy, which has been really helpful for me, is called IFS, Internal Family Systems, and that's been transformative. It's helped me get a framework for understanding how the parts of me that developed to keep me safe, like the achiever, the fawner, perfectionist part, they weren't flaws. They were brilliant adaptations, which kept me safe and honestly, in many ways, saved my life. And in IFS, the wounded child part is called exile part, and she's the one that carries the pain, the shame, and the fear. And that's the 14-year-old girl that I introduce you to at the beginning of this. And the work is really learning to reparent that girl, to give her the safety that she never had, and to let her know that she doesn't need to perform or to run anymore. And Steve, as you mentioned, healing isn't linear. There's hard days, there's setbacks, but every day for me has been a conscious choice to keep showing up and to not abandon that 14-year-old girl.
That is really beautiful. And the other thing that really um, moved me was when you explained how you decided to settle because you wanted to move into advocacy work. And so I wanted you to be able to tell us what changes you think you want to see in terms of how institutions handle these things, education centers handle this, the justice systems. What is your dream? What is your hope now that you're in the advocacy sector?
Sure. So it's a couple of different roles that I'm playing, and right now I'm really focused on changing the consent law in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the only state in New England and one of 12 states around the country that doesn't have a exception for authority figures in the age of consent. So the age of consent is 16, and that means that a teacher can sexually exploit a 16 or 17-year-old student, and under the current law, it's not necessarily considered a crime, which is what happened in the Miss Halls and Rutledge case. And the problem goes a lot deeper than even the statute. Because there's no authority figure carve-out, predators can raise consent as a defense. So we've been talking about grooming. And so think about a teacher grooming a child for years, systematically breaking down boundaries, isolating her, and engineering her dependence on him. And then they can stand up in court and say she consented. And prosecutors know this, and they often don't want to take these type of cases because the law has handed predators a built-in escape hatch. And I think that it's obviously very clear to all of us, but not to lawmakers and not to everyone out there. But a student can't consent when an adult controls her grades, her college recommendations, her schedule. That's not a relationship. That's a power dynamic, and it's exploitation. And in my case, when in the Miss Hall's case, when the district attorney first reviewed the case, they said what happened was profoundly troubling, but not illegal. So you just with that for a second. It's a predator running a system for 3 decades in a school full of children, and this law says we can't touch him. And so that needs to change. And as a result of Melissa and I coming forward, and another good thing about the press coverage is that it got the attention of politicians, and one politician entered a bill in the Massachusetts legislature, and that's Representative Lee Davis, and the bill is H4538, and that's to close the loophole. So the age of consent remains 16, but it creates a carve-out for authority figures and doesn't allow them to claim consent. And it also mandates prevention policies, training, student education, and stronger background checks, which are all extremely needed as well. And so the bill has now passed through the Judiciary Committee, and it's currently sitting in the House Ways and Means Committee. And I think that that's where people listening can really use their own voices to help us in this fight to pass this law right now. Massachusetts is one of the least transparent legislatures in the country. The Ways and Means Committee is currently considering over 700 bills, and most of them die in committee. They never make it to the floor. They just disappear. And so we really need everyone to pay attention to this. And if it gets to the floor, it will in all likelihood pass. Governor Healy, has already said that she'll sign it. It has no public opposition. Educators support it, district attorneys support it, and lawmakers don't want to pay attention to this. I think now society is changing because of the Epstein survivors and their extraordinary courage, which forced our nation to confront these power dynamics in a different way. And Chessy, your fight and your continued advocacy has also done the same thing. So people are paying attention now in the way that they weren't before. And if listeners live in Massachusetts, they can meet with their lawmakers, and they can tell them to speak with the Ways and Means Committee and urge an ought-to-pass vote on H4538. And if they don't live in Massachusetts, they can still help out. So for a lot of the young people wondering what they can do to get involved in advocacy in the survivor space, this is something that they can get involved in. They can call, email, write to the Speaker of the House in Massachusetts, Ron Mariano, and the Ways and Means Committee Chair, Aaron Michalowicz, and they can post on social media, talk about the loophole, share the episode, write about it. We need to make it so visible and so undeniable that it just becomes so hard not to pass. And so we really just need not silence now, we need volume. And that advocacy has been really helpful because I think all survivors, when they come forward publicly, they want to give back. And this is a way that I feel like I can give back to other survivors.
You truly are, and you're making a difference. And our community at I Have the Right To and Beyond will be working with you to help get this passed. So at the end of our episodes, we like to ask our guests to complete their own I Have the Right To statements, something that's meaningful to them or to their missions or communities. So we'd love to hear your I Have the Right To statement.
Thank you. Yes, I have the right to trust myself, to stop fawning for approval or for safety, to honor my needs and boundaries and my truth without guilt or apology.
I love that. Thank you so much, Hilary, for being here today and for speaking with us. And if this episode resonated with you, we invite you to share it, continue the conversation, and follow Hilary Simon in the House Bill 4538 as it passes, hopefully. And use your voice, use your autonomy to advocate for tactile things that will support survivors in your community. Thank you for being part of the Aspire community, for listening, learning, and showing up for a world where everyone has the right to safety, dignity, and their voice.
Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about workshops and programming available for students, educators, parents, and community members at ihavetherightto.org.